see this, it says deep sleep brain waves, and the regulation of daytime insulin sensitivity and glucose control. Well, in order to understand that, let's just go back very quickly to some ideas about sleep, which we know is essential for metabolic health. And if you remember, there are 4 stages of sleep. There is the REM sleep, which is about 25% of sleep time in adults. It's much greater in infants. And that REM sleep increases with each cycle as you go through the night. And that is what that REM stands for, rapid eye movement sleep. And that's the time when you're moving your body around and you may be talking and doing all kinds of other stuff. You're at the lightest form of sleep. But what we're going to be looking at today is the non-REM. It's the deeper sleep, specifically at stages 3 and 4. And that represents about 75% of sleep time. And we normally should have long enough sleep every night to get 4 or 5 of those cycles. And the first 2 cycles, which have very deep stage 4 or deep sleep, they're much longer and deeper. So sleep in general is a time for restoring, repairing the body at a cellular level. And it also includes the maintenance of the immune system and metabolic functions. That's what the body is trying to do during sleep. It's a very active period of repair. And especially in stages 3 and 4, which we'll be discussing today, that's the deep, slow wave sleep. It's important, turns out, for insulin use to regulate blood sugar. And this is just another very quick slide, which is from another study, and it's the impact of sleep disorders on glucose metabolism. And this is a study from 2015, which tells you that if you have a bunch of sleep disorders, could be sleep apnea. The larger term is obstructive sleep apnea syndrome, or short sleep, you're not getting enough sleep, or your circadian rhythm is misaligned, you've been traveling too much across the world and not getting enough time to get your circadian rhythm back, etc. All of that causes a number of things in the body, from sympathetic activation, or the sympathetic autonomic nervous system overrides the parasympathetic, etc. Oxidative stress, activation of many inflammatory pathways, and increased leptin, which is increased appetite, or decreased adiponectin, which is a decreased insulin sensitivity. All of that happens. And what does it do? It causes the cells to have insulin resistance, to not allowing glucose in, and it affects the ability of the pancreatic beta cells. Those are the cells that produce insulin in the pancreas. It makes them dysfunctional. All of that leads to what? Glucose intolerance and type 2 diabetes. So with that as a preface, we get to this actual report of coordinated human sleeping brain waves that map peripheral body glucose homeostasis. And what's the summary of this study? They say that if you couple 2 things that go on during stage 3 and 4, mostly during stage 4, that slow oscillations that you see on EEGs and spindles, which we'll go into in a minute, during sleep, that can predict quite well the next day's insulin-dependent glucose regulation, suggesting, in effect, that there is a central sleep biomarker of metabolic homeostasis that is able to support what is going on peripherally, what's going on in the rest of the body in terms of its glycemic equilibrium, the equilibrium in using glucose, and that's affected by the brain. So we know that diabetes affects, they say here, greater than 420 million people. I will submit to you it's much greater than that, but even that is a tremendous number of people. That's a WHO, the World Health Organization statistic. And studies suggest that one major factor that impairs blood glucose equilibrium, which is so important to metabolic health, is having too little sleep. So both acute and chronic partial sleep restriction, including non-rapid eye movement, we'll call it NREM, slow wave sleep, is able to impair glucose tolerance and insulin sensitivity. That means you get insulin resistant. Conversely, if you get better sleep, if you start sleeping more, better sleep, that's going to improve glucose metabolism. So something going on here. But what isn't known is why. Why is that happening? So the authors of this study say that currently the mechanism or mechanisms through which sleep optimally governs next day glucose homeostasis in humans really remains unknown. We don't know all the reasons, but we're getting closer to understanding that. There was a recent seminal study in rodents in which they found that the hippocampus part of the brain has sharp wave ripples, very, very quick ripples in the way the cells respond. And it can be temporarily coupled with NREM slow oscillations and sleep spindles. And that is associated with moment to moment, top down, meaning from the brain down, regulation of peripheral blood glucose in the rest of the body through the activation of another part of the brain, which is the hypothalamus. And we know that that is involved in everything from glucose control to cortisol, to a control of the adrenals, etc. And the results in the present study are indicating the presence of very similar sleeping brain glycemic association that you're observing in humans. And that's able to predict optimal next day regulation of peripheral blood glucose levels. And how is that happening? Well, this is a schematic from that study, which is saying that synchronized brain waves start a chain reaction. And those brain waves, by the way, are the coupled slow oscillation brain waves together with these spindles, which you've noticed I've put down here below, which are bursts of brain activity, most actively evident during stage 2, but also in stage 3 and 4. Very, very brief. They last a little bit more or less than a second. And if you couple those two, those brain reactions work downward to affect the heart and then peripherally to alter the body's regulation of blood sugar. And it's the combination of these two brain waves, the slow oscillations and the spindles, that is able to predict an increase in cell sensitivity to insulin. In other words, receptors are allowing glucose to get into the cell. It doesn't affect the pancreatic beta cells. It's not affecting how insulin is being produced. It's affecting what happens at the cell level, which consequentially, and of course beneficially, lowers blood glucose levels. And when they looked at all of the different things that could be from brain activity that could be affecting what we're talking about here, about glucose and insulin resistance, what came out clearly to be the top predictor was the proportion of slow oscillations in this non-REM period, stage 3 and 4, coupled together with spindle activity. That is the best predictor of fasting glucose and insulin resistance. So the possible mechanisms that are explaining this, and this, the issue of deficient sleep and impaired blood glucose control is what? What we think is happening is that there's an alteration, as I mentioned a little earlier, in the autonomic sympathovagal balance. There is a nerve, the vagus nerve, and the sympathetic nervous system, the autonomic nervous system, affects the body through the vagus nerve. And if there is a bias, if there is more sympathetic activity over parasympathetic activity, that is going to have a major control, which leads to insulin resistance. That means if you have more sympathetic activity, greater insulin resistance and metabolic dysfunction. Other pathways may exist, of course, that can account for the additional variance in this relationship that is not explained by this lowering of parasympathetic activity. So what's the conclusion? The findings suggest a sleeping brain glycemic body framework of insulin-associated glucose homeostasis. The brain controls how insulin allows glucose into the cells. And it further re-emphasizes the importance of sleep, adequate sleep, in the clinical management of hyperglycemia, meaning too much glucose, and diabetes. What are the key takeaways? If you couple non-REM sleep brainwaves, they predict the next day's glucose control. This sleep glucose association is partially mediated by autonomic activity, meaning by the sympathetic or parasympathetic activity. And sleep may regulate glycemic status selectively via what? Via the cell's insulin sensitivity. And the non-REM brainwaves therefore offer a very interesting glycemic biomarker and a potential, this is important, a potential therapeutic target.